Hello again. This short video is going to talk about how to use PowerPoint effectively in this class. Now this might not be exactly how other teachers want you to use PowerPoint, but this is specifically what I'm going to be looking for, so I want you to try and take advantage of the knowledge I'm going to be giving you here so you can get the best possible grade on your speech. One of the things I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be talking specifically about how to format your PowerPoints and then how to deliver using your PowerPoints. So first off, in terms of the formatting, there's going to be 4 things I want to talk about. I'm going to talk about backgrounds, fonts, animations, and content. First off, when we're using PowerPoint, we need to make sure we have backgrounds that are going to be appropriate to use with our PowerPoints. Now this is especially important when you're considering, is your audience going to be able to see and understand the information that's on your PowerPoint? If a visual aid is actually distracting, if your audience is trying to read what's on your visual aid and then can't pay attention to you, that's not helping you out with your speech. It's not aiding your speech, it's actually hurting your speech. So that's why backgrounds are so important. A couple of things to think about when you're looking at your backgrounds. You want to make sure your background is an uncluttered background, so it should be very simple. You'll notice that up to this point, the backgrounds in this PowerPoint have all been very white, very plain, and it's very easy to read. It looks a little bit boring, but it's not going to distract you. Another thing you need to think about is going to be room lighting. So if the lighting in the room that you're going to be using is very bright, you may need to use a lighter colored background. If the lighting in your room is going to be very dark, you may be able to get away with a darker background. You just want to think about the room that you're going to be sitting in, or the room that your audience is going to be sitting in, and how the coloring of the background of your PowerPoint is going to impact them. And then the last thing you want to think about is the background you're using going to be a stock background, or are you going to create something absolutely new? If you're giving a presentation in class, a stock background is probably fine. If you're giving a multi-million-dollar presentation, you may want to not use a stock background from PowerPoint. You may want to create something that's your own that would be a little bit more unique. So let's go through some examples of backgrounds. When you're looking at this PowerPoint on your screen, it may be a little bit easier to read. However, you can see where around the word can, it might be difficult, depending on the lighting of your room, for your audience members to see that. When you're using this kind of a background slide, it's maybe easier to read the "can you all read this" at the top of the PowerPoint slide because it's black. However, down towards the bottom where it's a lighter color, it might be more difficult to read. And you'll see that this green slide is even more difficult to read with the white text on the green. So it's things you want to think about. This is more of an uncluttered type of background that we've been talking about, and that might be better depending on the lighting in your room. Again, you want to check on that. And this PowerPoint slide is one of those stock PowerPoint slides that may or may not be a positive thing depending on what you're trying to do. If you'll notice, this is a very small text on a very large slide. The emphasis is more on the orange dots than it is on the text. So is that really helping aid you visually, or is it not? The strengths and weaknesses of this PowerPoint slide are that it is a little bit fancier than just the plain white PowerPoint slides that I've been using. It has a little touch of color, but it is also a very easy to see type of slide. So that's something you can think about too. Again, this is one that has just a pop of color. A couple of things to just think about. So when you're looking at your backgrounds, try to make sure that your background is going to work with that lighting. It's not going to be a cluttered type of background that's going to distract, and then it's going to be appropriate in terms of if it's a stock image or not. Another thing we need to think about with PowerPoint is we want to think about font. And when we're looking at font, there are 3 things we want to consider. We want to make sure that our font is a very clear kind of font. On these main PowerPoint slides I've been using with this as notes here for you, you'll notice that I've been using, I think it's Arial font. It's a very clear type of font. You shouldn't have any trouble trying to read that. Your font should also be large enough, especially if you are going to be speaking in a room that's very large. You want to make sure that the font is going to be able to be seen by everyone that's in the room. And the third thing you want to think about is you want to make sure that you have consistent font throughout your presentation. If you don't, then your audience members might get distracted by that. It'll also look less professional. So let's look at a couple of different types of fonts. As you're looking through this slide and you're reading through the different fonts, you may be noticing that some fonts are easier to read than others. Specifically, the first line and the second line are maybe easier to read. Does this help you understand my, right? But some of the other lines in there, such as trying to read down towards the bottom, or point or are, Those ones are lines that are maybe a little bit more difficult to read, especially as they get smaller. So you want to think about, is this font going to be clear? There's a couple of things you can consider with that. There are two types of fonts. There is a serif font and a sans serif font. A serif font basically means it's got those little embellishments on it. It's up at the top. You can see that the F looks a little bit fancier on serif font than the F for sans serif font. So serif fonts have a little bit more going on with them than a sans serif font. A sans serif font is going to be a very plain type of font. And in general, the rule of thumb that you want to go with is if you're going to have larger text, it doesn't matter as much if you're using a serif or a sans serif font. However, if you're using smaller text, a sans serif font will always be easier to read and understand. The next thing I want you to think about is I want you to think about animation. Now, in our class, you really want to have a simple, just a small amount of animation in your PowerPoint slides. I didn't use animation in this specific tutorial because I wanted to keep this a very simple tutorial for you to be able to understand more, but I do want to highlight the fact that when you're using animation, you should not be doing things like boxing in. You shouldn't have the words fan in, it shouldn't drip in like it's rain or anything like that. It should be just appearing or fading in or fading out, something very, very simple. You should not have any sounds along with your animation. You want that to be very professional. And really, when it comes down to animation, less is going to be more. So don't over-animate your presentations, because in reality, it's just going to distract. It's not going to be an aid, it's going to be a distraction. So the next type of thing we want to talk about is we want to talk about some content stuff. Now, in terms of the content with PowerPoint, there are 4 things we want to talk about. We want to keep the content very simple. You'll notice on all of the white PowerPoint slides that I've been using as notes that I have had a very simple number of bullet points that I've been talking about. I haven't had more than maybe 10 or 15 words on any given slide, and that's really what you need to think about. You should not have more than 10 to 15 words on your slide. Some people would say don't have more than 9 words on a slide, but I'll allow you to have a few more than that. Your PowerPoint slides should be aids to your speaking as well. They shouldn't be a crutch. So if you're reading everything off of your PowerPoint slide, you're not using it as a visual aid, you're using it as a visual crutch. That's why you have note cards. You have note cards to be able to keep your notes in order. That shouldn't be up on the screen. Third, you want to make sure that you're explaining everything that's actually on your PowerPoint slides. You'll notice again, I only have a few simple words bullet pointed on these slides, and then I explain what I mean for each of these bullet points. And that's what you should be trying to do with these. The words you have up there should be used to make sure that your audience is understanding what you're trying to say. It should be aiding in their understanding. And lastly, when you're looking at content, you want to make sure that you are spell checking your content. The easiest way for you to lose credibility with your audience is to not have your words spell checked. So let's look through a couple of examples of these. First off, how many people have seen a PowerPoint slide that looks something like this? I've seen many professors that have notes up on a PowerPoint slide that look like this, and when I was taking classes in college, it was pretty common. You'll also notice that some of my PowerPoint slides in previous presentations online that I've screencast out maybe have had a lot of words like this. Now, if you're using PowerPoint to give out notes in a teaching setting of something or something like that, that might be more appropriate to have this much content. However, in our case, in our classroom, and in the case of most presentations you're going to be giving, this is too much information. It's going to be a crutch instead of an aid, and it's not going to help your audience actually understand what you're saying. What it's going to do is it's going to distract them. It's going to take away the attention from you and put it onto your visual aid. So it gets to the point where it's like, why did I have to come to this presentation? I could have just read your PowerPoint. That's not what we want to do. In addition to keeping our content simple, we want to make sure that we actually use some blank slides. Like you'll notice this black slide that I have brought up here. In between each of our content slides, we want to have a blank slide that we can use so we can hide the content that we're not using when we don't need it. We do this to direct the attention of our audience members either to us or to our screen. So use those blank slides to make sure you're only revealing your visual aid when you're ready to do so. In terms of content, you may decide to use some types of images. And you want to make sure those images are very easy to understand. Again, we're keeping them with that idea of being simple and that we can explain those. So you'll notice that with this chart, I have labeled the different parts of the chart. It's very clear to see what those colors are, and that makes it a lot more sense for your audience members. So that's one of the things to think about. As you're considering if you're going to put some different pictures on your slides, you want to think about, is this going to be a clear picture for my audience to see? Have I cited where I got this picture from? Does this actually aid in what I'm trying to say? Okay, so this picture would not necessarily be one, especially with the text down at the bottom being so small and with the picture being kind of grainy, this wouldn't be a picture we would want to use. Again, this would be a picture that would be very difficult for our audience members to see. There's a lot of information on there, there's a lot of characters on there, and it doesn't actually help us to be able to differentiate between what's going on. Instead of this picture, we would probably want to use a picture like this if we were trying to create a visual aid with The Simpsons. It's very clear to see the faces of The Simpsons, the characters, and you can tell what you're supposed to focus on as compared to this previous picture that we had been looking at. In terms of credibility, like I said, make sure that you are working with your content and you're actually spell checking your words. I don't think that we need to talk about that too much more, but make sure your words are spell checked and that you're not using text to speech. You don't want any LOLs or anything like that. Otherwise I may be LMFAO. I don't know what that is. Anyway. Alright, a couple of things left here to talk about in terms of delivery. Again, we want to talk about, in terms of delivery, we don't want to use this as a crutch, we want this to be an aid. And second off, PowerPoint should just be your talking points. So first off, in terms of when you're using your delivery, you should not have so much information in your slides that it becomes a crutch. It should just be an aid. It should be something that helps your audience members remember what you're talking about. So if you get to the point where you're reading off of your slides because you have that much text, it's not aiding you, it's hurting you. And finally, you want to, again, just make sure that these are talking points that you can touch on. So if you look at the difference between this screen and the screens that I've been using that have been very similar to this screen here that I have displayed now, you'll notice that it's very different. And this screen is much more something that you're going to focus on what I'm saying and not so much just reading, as opposed to this screen where you're reading and it's distracting and you don't know if you're supposed to listen to me or read what's on the screen. So I hope that this has helped, and I hope this will help you create better PowerPoints for your presentations.